the James Irvine Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund, and the Annie E. Casey Foundation.
Coming up on NCM TV, the latest youth craze, the new video game, Dance Dance Revolution. Also, an essay by Youth Outlook magazine editor on what people are listening to since September 11th. But first, an interview with hip-hop historian and radio personality Davey D. All next on NCM TV's New California Media.
No one cares about race anymore? We're talking about black people.
It's impossible to define what an Asian American film is. They do it with some exhaustive features. Culture and identity is the issue. We're in this together.
We are intertwined.
This is our race.
We call ourselves the New California Media.
Hello and welcome. I'm David Muhammad, your host of NCM TV, New California Media. This is your program for the news and views of the nation's emerging new majority. Many things have changed since September 11th, the economy, our security, and even parts of our culture. On today's show, we explore youth culture, new trends, and changes. Disco meets video game and a new craze catching arcades by storm, Dance Dance Revolution. Later, Kevin Weston, editor of Youth Outlook News magazine, discusses what young people are listening to in this new post-September 11th era. But first, we talk to renowned hip-hop historian and radio personality Davey D. Spending 11 years as a disc jockey for KMEL, 8 of those years as the community affairs director for the Clear Channel station, and the past 6 years hosting Street Knowledge, a weekly show that featured community leaders, youth activists, politicians, and entertainers, including President Bill Clinton, Reverend Jesse Jackson, Russell Simmons, and more. But while enjoying huge community support, Davey D was laid off by the station 2 months ago, sparking protests and large media coverage. Davey D joins us in the studio to discuss these matters and more. Thank you for coming, Davey.
Thank you for having me.
Many people have said after the show in which you had Congresswoman Barbara Lee, right after she cast that lone vote against giving President Bush the $40 billion to fight this war on terrorism, and some of the anti-war sentiment on your show that your firing was politically motivated. How would you respond?
The station's official position has been that it was strictly budget cuts, and there have been budget cuts throughout the industry. From the community standpoint, they started trying to connect dots. The timing. I mean, when I had Barbara Lee on, we had beaten probably every news media outlet in the country in getting her, and not only just getting her, but having a really in-depth interview, which was quickly followed up by me sending out a transcript of that show to about 100,000 people who subscribe to the mailing list that we have, email list. So immediately people had to quote from that. So that was big news for a lot of folks. Prior to that, there was a list of songs that the Clear Channel Corporation, that was attributed to the Clear Channel Corporation, saying that these were songs that could not be aired because of the sensitive nature of the material.
They banned these songs from being played.
Well, this is what was said. Now, internally, we were told that that wasn't really the case, but there was never really a public counting of those type of perspectives, so people had that in the back of their mind.
Certainly.
And then you're in an area where I think people in the Bay Area in particular, a lot of folks raise a lot of questions. And in particular in our communities, there's a lot of questions as to what's going on, why, and et cetera, et cetera. So at a point in time where I think people were kind of looking at the coverage, which seemed to be going in one direction, they had these things in the back of their mind. And then we have very few people around the country at this point, me being one of them, who were in prime positions to really discuss the various other perspectives that weren't necessarily being echoed in the mainstream. When the firing happened, which was 2 weeks after the interview, people just looked and said, one plus one equals 2 plus 1 equals 3, and that was that. So the station maintains that it had nothing to do with that, but then people raised the valid question after 11 years, why suddenly?
Absolutely.
You just don't make budget cuts all of a sudden overnight. There have been people who have been let go who knew that they were going to be let go 3 or 4 months down the road. That was not the case in my situation.
So you had no forewarning, and I think the radio show after Barbara Lee, I think I was on, which may have been the last one, where there was
the discussion of the flag.
The discussion of the flag, where the call-ins was enormously against kind of the war sentiment, the patriotism that was brewing, and so it wasn't just your show. In fact, I remember that show, you were being the devil's advocate, but the calls were
in the other direction. Well, I think, you know, overall what you're looking at is a scenario where after September 11th, I think anybody's reaction is not something that you can label, criticize, or even take action on, because people were in a period of mourning as far as I'm concerned. People fell out of buildings, planes, the whole nine. Everybody had the reaction, and I think I give validity to all those reactions, from the person who says, pick up a gun and go after everybody, to the person that says, let's sit and pray, because that's part of just flushing that out. And I think in our communities, it's important to have vehicles where you can flush out all these sentiments. For example, discussing what the flag means in the African-American community is very interesting. A lot of people have flags on the back of their car. I have them on the back of mine. But at the same time, I remember going to conventions where prominent leaders in the community have said, this flag is a symbol of oppression. So how do you come to terms with that? And I think that's an issue that, well, we did discuss it, and that's an issue that needed to be discussed, so that people feel comfortable that, hey, I'm not the only one feeling this. Like, I really want to carry a flag, even though 5 years ago I said the opposite, and others are, you know, in the other camp, like, no, this is even more proof. So,
well, where is the state of radio then? Because you have all of these different perspectives, and especially urban formatted radio. You take Clear Channel, they own about 8 or 10 stations just in the Bay Area, and I think over 1,000 nationwide.
Right.
Is that good for radio, or is that too much concentration?
well, this happened in the 90s with the deregulation, and I don't think it's a good thing, because what happens is it makes the companies that own these outlets to be more committed to achieving the bottom line. And when you go for the bottom line, it means you have to go for the least common denominator. So you start to compartmentalize people. You're the African station, you're the Latino station, you're the older station, you're for the white folks in the suburbs station, those type of deals. And then you start to draw a loose net, as opposed to really looking and saying, what are the nuances? And one of the nuances, for example, would have been a discussion about what the flag means. That may have been a very different conversation than somebody who's trying to reach, say, an older mainstream audience, because these are issues that we have to deal with. For example, another conversation would have been, which we did have, how are you feeling towards the police? You know, everybody loves the police and they're heroes now because of September 11th. But for us, that's, you know, there were still fresh wounds, even from this year, you know, because of some incidents of brutality that were coming up. And so those type of things needed to be flushed out. And sure, you can have private conversations, and you could do it in your church and at your youth center, but there's a magic about radio, and with the African-American audience, they especially use radio as a primary source of information. It's always historically been a community outlet for the African-American community, and they tend to be the most loyal audience. And so for us, that is important. And so when you look at that, you know, to go back to answering your question, is it a good thing? It isn't a good thing when you feel that you're in a position where you can't afford to deal with the subtleties and nuances of the community, where you're just looking at what's going to get the bottom line.
Well, I know Camille wasn't the only gig that you had. Where's Davey D going from here? What is radio, website, book?
Well, I always had a website. That was probably one of the smartest things I did, was invest early on, before they was even calling it an internet. You know, website and a newsletter that goes along with it. So my newsletter goes out. It's a hip-hop political newsletter. It goes out to maybe, on our subscriber base alone, it's about 100,000 people. You know, so that's pretty sizable. And the website has always been, you know, writing and being able to express myself without having to deal with somebody else's agenda has always been a hallmark. And so that I continue to do. Finishing up a book, you know, the book is pretty much done, but after 9/11, a lot has changed. And since it's not been handed into the publisher, why not add perspectives to that? So that's going on right now.
Wait to get that out?
Hopefully I go back to New York before the end of the year, and that gets taken around. You know, so there are people that are interested. And, you know, to be honest, after 11 years of being at a place that's almost a third of my life, you're talking about a situation where, fortunately, I just decided to detox. And meaning that I didn't want to jump into anything immediately, because you need time to just kind of give yourself some distance and look at what's happening.
Well, I know, and as we close this segment, I know that you were part of a hip-hop summit in Chicago. You're a part of a hip-hop summit this last year with Russell Simmons in New York, and I understand there's an upcoming hip-hop summit in Los Angeles for the West Coast in February. What are the plans for that summit, and why such a summit?
Well, summits, again, these are needed. There's a lot of things going on with hip-hop that you need to discuss. There's various aspects. And going back to even your first question, what is radio? Radio plays the puffies and